Prince Harry's fairy tale of entitlement just took a crash landing. Ahead of the upcoming Invictus Games, insiders reveal Harry made a very specific demand: a private jet, funded not by his personal fortune but by Invictus itself. He wanted the Veterans Organization, built on donations and goodwill, to bankroll his luxury flight. But this time he was told no. Not politely, not wrapped in diplomatic niceties, but in blunt, undeniable words from CEO. Use your personal money for your jet, not the veterans' money. It was a refusal that stunned Harry and left him humiliated. For years, he has enjoyed the illusion that his royal birth and his association with Invictus gave him untouchable status. But in one sharp stroke, the organization reminded him that this isn't about him, his ego, or his comfort. It's about the veterans. And they will not have their sacrifices cheapened by subsidizing his taste for royal treatment. The Invictus Games was once Prince Harry's crown jewel, a global platform he proudly branded as his personal legacy project, showcasing wounded veterans who found hope through sport. For a while, the world believed in the purity of his mission, but behind the glossy speeches and tearful photo ops, a different Harry was emerging, one who saw Invictus not just as a charity, but as a stage for his royal persona. The demand for a private jet was not an isolated request. According to sources within the organization, it was the latest in a string of entitled behaviors that had been quietly tolerated. Harry, accustomed to the red carpets of Hollywood and the pampered lifestyle of Montecito, had grown detached from the gritty realities of the very men and women Invictus represents. For him, travel wasn't about reaching veterans or raising awareness. It was about image, optics, and convenience. A commercial flight, in Harry's view, was beneath him. Yet the irony was glaring. Many of the veterans competing at Invictus arrived after grueling, uncomfortable journeys, often with physical pain and limited resources. Harry wanted the red carpet rolled out, while they came in with nothing but determination. The CEO's denial exposed a contradiction. It wasn't just a budgetary decision. It was a symbolic rejection of Harry's inflated self-image. The organization, once a safe zone, had drawn a line. Harry's fury, insiders say, was palpable. He was blindsided, not by the logistics, but by the principle. The denial cut deeper than money. It was a direct challenge to his authority. For years, Harry believed Invictus was his unshakable fiefdom. He leveraged it for interviews, documentaries, and even Netflix content. But what was once portrayed as his noble dedication to veterans has increasingly been criticized as a convenient backdrop for self-promotion. The veterans themselves have noticed. Some are quietly whispering about the hypocrisy of Harry jetting across the world in luxury, while they, the true heroes, sit in economy seats or struggle to fund their trips. The private jet demand was a final straw, a symbol of how far Harry had drifted from the very ethos of the Games. And the CEO's statement was crafted to sting. Use your personal money for your jet, not the veterans' money. That one sentence shattered the illusion that Harry could always bend Invictus to his will. It wasn't just about travel, it was about values. The veteran sacrifices were being defended against his ego. This wasn't the first time Harry's entitlement has caused friction. Past reports detail his insistence on luxury hotel suites, security teams funded by event sponsors, and star-studded receptions designed more for cameras and community. Each time, organizers swallowed their frustrations for the sake of harmony. But this time they pushed back, and the world noticed. Harry's humiliation didn't end with the private jet refusal. Word leaked fast, and suddenly, media outlets around the globe pounced on the story. The narrative shifted almost overnight. Harry was no longer the heroic founder, but the pampered prince trying to exploit a veteran's cause. Critics pointed out the contradiction between Harry's environmental preaching and his obsession with private jets. How could he, who once gave speeches about climate change and reducing carbon footprints, demand a private aircraft for a charity event? The hypocrisy was undeniable, and the backlash was brutal. What made matters worse was Meghan Markle's alleged reaction. According to Palace Watchers, Meghan had encouraged Harry to secure a private jet, framing it as essential for maintaining their brand. For the couple, appearances were everything, and the humiliation of being spotted in economy or business class was unthinkable. But Invictus wasn't playing that game anymore. The optics were devastating. A prince who once fought in Afghanistan, now fighting for luxury perks, while the soldiers he claimed to champion endure discomfort without complaint. The fallout has exposed something Harry has long feared, that Invictus no longer needs him as much as he needs it. When the games launched, Harry's royal status was a magnet. His charisma, military service, and personal charm drew cameras and donors. But as the years passed, the veterans themselves became the story. Their courage, resilience, and triumphs eclipsed Harry's role. And now, with the CEO's public stand, it's clear that the games can thrive without his indulgences. Harry, however, cannot thrive without Invictus. It is his last bastion of credibility, the only project that still paints him in a positive light. Without it, he is just another celebrity in Montecito, stripped of purpose, scrambling for relevance. This is why the jet denial struck so deeply. It wasn't just about transportation. It was about identity. Without royal titles, without palace influence, Harry's self-image is tied to Invictus. And now, even that is slipping away. The Invictus Games are approaching fast, but Harry arrives not as a triumphant founder, but as a man exposed. The world has seen behind the curtain. His demand for privilege has revealed more about him than any speech ever could. For veterans, this year's games are about perseverance, dignity, and honor. For Harry, they are about damage control. He faces a choice: humble himself and return to the core values of the event, or double down on entitlement and risk losing the one thing that still connects him to the world stage. Prince Harry's fairy tale of entitlement just took a crash landing. Ahead of the upcoming Invictus Games, insiders reveal Harry made a very specific demand: a private jet, funded not by his personal fortune but by Invictus itself. He wanted the Veterans Organization, built on donations and goodwill, to bankroll his luxury flight. But this time, he was told no. Not politely, not wrapped in diplomatic niceties, but in blunt, undeniable words from the CEO. Use your personal money for your jet, not the veterans' money. It was a refusal that stunned Harry and left him humiliated. For years, he has enjoyed the illusion that his royal birth and his association with Invictus gave him untouchable status. But in one sharp stroke, the organization reminded him that this isn't about him, his ego, or his comfort. It's about the veterans. And they will not have their sacrifices cheapened by subsidizing his taste for royal treatment. The fallout was immediate. Whispers spread across planning committees, volunteers, and veterans who had dedicated months preparing for the games. Many were quietly relieved that the CEO had finally drawn a line in the sand. Harry, they believe, had increasingly blurred the lines between being a patron and being a celebrity who expected royal-level indulgences. His insistence on luxury accommodations, VIP treatment, and red carpet arrivals had already raised eyebrows. But demanding a private jet on the charity's dime crossed a threshold even his closest allies could not justify. Behind closed doors, tension boiled. Organizers, already under pressure to meet budgets and honor sponsors' commitments, viewed Harry's demand as reckless. Donations meant for supporting wounded veterans were never intended to bankroll luxury aviation. To approve such a request would have been catastrophic, a betrayal of trust that could have crippled the game's reputation. The refusal was not merely administrative. It was a calculated act of protection for the very soul of Invictus. Harry's reaction, however, was explosive. Sources close to the boardroom recount how his composure cracked in ways rarely seen in public. His voice raised, his temper flared, and his word betrayed the very entitlement that had long been whispered about him. He lashed out, reminding them of his role as founder, insisting that without his name and royal status, Invictus would not exist. He demanded recognition, deference, and above all, obedience. But this time, his words fell flat. The CEO, backed by a growing number of board members, refused to bend. They reminded him that the veterans, not Harry, are the heartbeat of the games, that sponsors give money because they believe in the cause, not because they wish to indulge a prince's whims, and that Invictus cannot and will not be treated as Harry's personal piggy bank. The scene left a mark. Insiders say the moment has been described as a turning point, a shift in power dynamics that Harry had never before experienced within Invictus. For the first time, his authority was openly challenged and his request denied without fear of retribution. The curtain of royal privilege had been torn down, exposing Harry as just another man demanding too much from those who owed him nothing. What followed was even more telling. In the days after the confrontation, murmurs began to spread among veterans and volunteers. Stories circulated of past extravagances, luxury suites, chauffeurs, and security demands, all quietly absorbed by the charity in the name of preserving Harry's royal image. For years, these indulgences had been tolerated, explained away as necessary to keep the games in the public eye. But now, with this latest jet request exposed, the tolerance had vanished. Veterans, many of whom had sacrificed limbs, livelihoods, and peace of mind in service to their countries, saw the contrast with piercing clarity. While they arrived on commercial flights, often in cramped seats with minimal comfort, Harry expected private jets at charity expense. The optics were damning. The very figure who had once championed their resilience now appeared to live in a bubble of privilege, disconnected from the reality of those he claimed to serve. The CEO's refusal struck a deeper chord than just financial responsibility. It symbolized resistance to a growing pattern of behavior that risked overshadowing Invictus itself. If unchecked, Harry's demands could transform the games into a vanity project rather than a platform of empowerment. The refusal was more than a budgetary decision. It was a statement. Invictus belongs to the veterans, not the prince. And yet, Harry's fury only grew. Sources close to him say he stormed out of key planning sessions, threatening to withdraw his participation, even suggesting that without his face, the games would collapse. It was a gamble, one rooted in ego rather than strategy, but it backfired. Instead of caving to his ultimatums, the leadership stood firm. The games would go on, with or without him, and in doing so, they revealed a painful truth Harry could not ignore. The veterans no longer needed him as much as he needed them. This reality gnawed at him. Once hailed as a compassionate prince who bridged the gap between royalty and veterans, Harry now risked being seen as a liability. His insistence on luxury painted him as tone-deaf at best, exploitive at worst. His temper confirmed suspicions that behind the polished speeches and solemn photo ops, he harbored a streak of arrogance that clashed with the humility of the game's participants. And yet, despite the humiliation, Harry pressed on. Instead of retreating into quiet reflection, he doubled down. Behind palace-like walls in Montecito, he raged a confidence about betrayal, about disloyalty, about being disrespected. He framed the CEO's refusal not as a principled stand, but as a personal attack. To him, this was mutiny, a deliberate attempt to undermine his authority, to embarrass him before the world. His anger festered, and with each retelling, he painted himself more as the victim than the cause. Meanwhile, the veterans and organizers grew more resolute. For them, the refusal had strengthened the game's integrity. It became a quiet rallying cry, proof that Invictus could withstand pressure, even from its founder. The veterans' voices grew louder, their stories more prominent, while Harry's demands faded into background noise of entitlement. The games, they realized, did not need royal drama to thrive. They needed only the courage and sacrifice of the men and women they honored. Still, Harry's shadow loomed. Media insiders already caught wind of the clash, sensing a scandal ripe for exposure. Journalists pieced together whispers of his jet demand, his tantrum, his threats of withdrawal. The story, once buried in boardroom walls, was beginning to take shape in the public eye. And when it breaks, as inevitably will, the damage to Harry's reputation could be catastrophic, because at its heart, this is more than a disagreement about travel arrangements. It is a battle over identity, over control, over the soul of Invictus itself. Is it a charity for veterans, built on sacrifice and resilience? Or is it a stage for a prince's ego, fueled by entitlement and excess? The refusal has drawn the line, and Harry's reaction has made it clear which side he stands on. Prince Harry's demand for a private jet had not been made in hushed tones or with the delicate discretion expected of someone claiming to represent a movement as noble as Invictus. Instead, it carried the unmistakable air of entitlement that has become his trademark in recent years. The request, delivered through aides and framed as necessary for security and convenience, was immediately met with raised eyebrows inside the organization. These weren't courtiers in gilded palaces, eager to satisfy every royal whim. These were veteran professionals and administrators who had built the games from scratch with grit and sacrifice. They knew exactly what Invictus stood for, and it was not subsidized in private luxury of a prince who walked away from the very institution. that once shielded him. The CEO's refusal spread like wildfire behind closed doors. Staff who had long felt suffocated by Harry's growing obsession with image saw the moment as a quiet vindication. For years, whispers circulated that the games had become less about veterans and more about him. The cameras always angled towards his face. His speeches always peppered with veiled royal grievances. His appearances carefully stage-managed to portray him as the torchbearer's sacrifice. But here, at last, was a line drawn in the sand. The Veterans Charity would not bankroll his extravagance. And in that instant, Harry was not just denied a jet. He was denied the fantasy that his influence could bend every institution to his will. What followed was a storm. Those close to Harry described his reaction not as disappointment, but fury. This was not a man humbled by a reality check, but one who saw himself betrayed by the very movement he claims to champion. He viewed the refusal as a humiliation, a public slap to his identity as founder and patron. In his mind, Invictus owed him more than respect. It owed him loyalty, deference, and unquestioning obedience. That illusion shattered. His response was to lash out, framing the decision as undermining his safety and jeopardizing the games. It was an argument dripping in irony. The man who fled royal duty claiming he wanted independence, now demanding the very organization built for veterans to underwrite his royal comfort. Behind the scenes, tensions escalated. Senior figures within Invictus, many of whom had silently tolerated Harry's eccentricities, began quietly aligning with the CEO's stance. Their reasoning was simple. The games exist for veterans, not for Harry's image. For years, sponsors and partners had raised concerns that the line between the Invictus mission and Harry's personal brand was blurring. Every glossy photo shoot, every Netflix camera crew, every carefully staged moment of him consoling a veteran seemed less about the veteran and more about the narrative of Prince Harry as savior. And now, with this private jet demand, the facade collapsed entirely. It wasn't just perception anymore, it was proof. The fallout within the palace corridors of Montecito was equally dramatic. Meghan, ever the strategist, reportedly urged Harry to reframe the incident as an issue of security optics. Her calculation was clear. If they could spin the denial as potential risk to Harry's safety, they could justify his demands without appearing spoiled. But those within Invictus weren't buying it. Veterans who had traveled on cramped commercial flights, lugging equipment, and wheelchairs through airports without complaint, found offensive to suggest that Harry's dignity required private jets, while their sacrifices were treated as logistical afterthoughts. For them, his argument was not just weak, it was insulting. What stung Harry the most was the ripple effect. News of the denial, though intended to remain internal, began to seep into whispers among donors, sponsors, and even rival media outlets. The story was too rich to suppress. The royal prince, supposedly the voice of veterans, demanding a luxury perk and being told no. It painted him not as a champion of Invictus, but as a parasite feeding off its goodwill. For an image-obsessed man who had spent years cultivating the persona of modern warrior for the people, it was a devastating blow. The refusal was more than logistical. It was symbolic. It shattered the illusion that Harry's title, even in exile, could bend rules without consequence. Yet rather than retreat and reflect, Harry doubled down. Reports emerged of tense phone calls between him and senior Invictus staff, where his tone shifted from aggrieved patron to outraged proprietor. He reminded them that without him, there would be no Invictus. He stressed at his connections, his visibility, his story with a fuel that made the games global. And in his words, there was a chilling undertone, a warning that his support could be withdrawn, leaving the organization adrift. But Invictus, to its credit, did not bow. Its leadership quietly signaled that the games were bigger than Harry and would survive with or without his gilded shadow. For the first time since its inception, Invictus had reclaimed its independence from its royal founder. As the clash unfolded, media outlets circled like vultures. Journalists who once hesitated to criticize Harry found new freedom in the revelation. It wasn't rumor or speculation. It was fact. Harry asked for a private jet, and he was denied. The contrast between his demand and the ethos of Invictus was too stark to ignore. Headlines framed him as hypocritical, tone-deaf, and self-absorbed. Critics seized on the moment as validation of long-standing suspicions that Harry had turned the games into a personal PR machine. What should have been a unifying lead-up to the upcoming Invictus Games instead morphed into a spectacle of royal entitlement colliding with veteran integrity. The implications stretched further than Harry anticipated. Sponsors, wary of negative press, quietly pressed for reassurance that donations would not be squandered on royal indulgence. Veterans, speaking anonymously, voiced disillusionment at how far the games seemed to stray from their founding spirit. And within Harry's own camp, the pressure mounted. His advisors scrambled to contain the fallout, aware that the image of Prince of the People was bleeding credibility. But Harry himself, according to those closest to him, refused to back down. He remained fixated on the idea that denial of his jet was not just a rejection of his request, but an attack on his identity. To concede would be to admit weakness, and weakness is something he cannot afford in a world that already views him as diminished without his royal machinery. The stage is now set for a clash of wills. Harry, bruised and furious, feels betrayed by the very project he built, while Invictus, emboldened by its leadership's defiance, is standing firm in its mission to protect the veterans above all else. What was once a harmonious alliance between Prince and Project has now hardened into confrontation, and the irony is unavoidable. Harry, who once founded Invictus to celebrate resilience, now finds his own image fractured, his entitlement exposed, and his role questioned like never before. For Prince Harry, the refusal became an obsession, gnawing at him day and night. In his mind, it wasn't simply about travel arrangements. It was about authority, respect, and above all, control. Invictus was supposed to be his creation, his crown jewel, the one project immune to criticism and immune to the crumbling of his royal status. But here he was, staring down the bitter reality. The games had matured beyond him, and worse, they dared to stand against him. To Harry, this wasn't a scheduling disagreement. It was mutiny. Inside Montecito, aides described the atmosphere as combustible. Meghan urged Harry to play the long game, to frame himself once again as the misunderstood victim. She drafted statements painting the issue as one of safety protocols and respect for veterans, subtly shifting the narrative to make it appear that his demand was aligned with protecting those who served. But Harry's temper overruled her strategy. He raged in calls, slammed doors during planning meetings, and insisted that Invictus owed him everything. His fixation was so intense that even those loyal to him began whispering unease. Was he fighting for the veterans or for his pride? Meanwhile, in the heart of London and across the Atlantic, the veterans themselves were watching. Many had long admired Harry for founding Invictus, but they also remembered the days when he was one of them, sleeping rough during training, flying into war zones, and living without fanfare. The man they saw now, fighting over private jets and luxury perks, felt like a stranger. Anonymous sources began speaking to sympathetic journalists, painting a picture of disillusionment. One veteran put it bluntly, "He built Invictus for us, but now it feels like we're being used for him." Sponsors, too, began to stir. Corporations that had poured millions into the games demanded clarification. Was their money funding adaptive sports programs or underwriting a prince's demands? Calls were made, emails exchanged, and in hushed tones, boardroom executives questioned whether the games could survive the optics of being tethered to Harry's spiraling reputation. The denial of the jet was one thing. The fear that Harry might retaliate by weaponizing his association with Invictus was another. For these companies, the risk of scandal outweighed the glow of royal endorsement. Harry began a subtle campaign, not in public speeches, but in private conversations with allies and selected media contacts. He framed the situation as one where he, the founder, was being disrespected, sidelined, even betrayed by the very organization he gave life to. He insisted that without his name, without his presence, Invictus would fade into obscurity. It was a veiled threat, an attempt to remind both sponsors and veterans that he remained a linchpin of their success. But rather than rally support, the tactic backfired. Whispers spread that Harry was holding the games hostage to his ego, for the veterans who had spilled sweat and blood to make Invictus real. The suggestion that the games lived or died on Harry's image was nothing short of insulting. The divide widened further when Harry, against advice, made a veiled reference during a public appearance. Standing before cameras, he spoke of people who forget the true mission of Invictus, and decisions being made that don't honor the sacrifices of our veterans. The words were deliberately vague, but insiders knew exactly what he meant. It was his way of punishing the leadership that had denied him, shaming them before the world without naming names. Yet the irony was glaring. While Harry preached sacrifice, his grievance was not about veterans, but about his own denied luxury. The hypocrisy was too rich for critics to ignore. British tabloids had a field day. Headlines screamed, "Prince of Privilege, Harry demands jet denied by Invictus." Op-eds questioned how a man who abandoned his royal duties could still demand royal treatment. Social media exploded with memes. Harry in aviator glasses seated on a golden jet. Veterans pushing wheelchairs through economy class aisles behind him. The mockery cut deep, for Harry has always feared ridicule more than open hostility. What was meant to be his untouchable legacy was now a punchline. Inside Invictus headquarters, the leadership doubled down. They issued a carefully worded statement affirming their commitment to veterans, their transparency in funding, and their independence as an organization. Though Harry's name was never mentioned, the subtext was crystal clear. The Games existed for veterans, not for the vanity of any one individual. The message sent shockwaves. To many observers, it was the first time Invictus had publicly asserted itself against Harry's shadow. It was the equivalent of a declaration of independence, and it left Harry isolated, enraged, and humiliated. The worst blow came from within the veteran community itself. Several prominent athletes, faces of the Games, decorated heroes who had become symbols of resilience, began quietly distancing themselves from Harry. One declined a photo shoot that would have paired them together. Another postponed an appearance at a fundraiser hosted by Archwell. Their reasoning was never stated openly, but those close to them admitted they didn't want their image tangled with a scandal about private jets and royal privilege. To be spurned by the very people Invictus was built for cut deeper than any tabloid headline. Those closest to him described his mood as defensive paranoia. He began to see critics everywhere, in journalists, in sponsors, even among veterans. He told friends he was being undermined, that forces within the establishment were using Invictus as a weapon to diminish him. The idea that a charity's refusal of a jet could be orchestrated by shadowy enemies fed his long-standing belief that he was targeted, conspired against, trapped in a web of betrayal. Instead of humility, it fueled defiance. Instead of reflection, it bred hostility. The feud had escalated far beyond logistics. It was now a battle for control of narrative, of image, of ownership of the Invictus Games themselves. Harry saw it as his creation, his legacy. The leadership saw it as belonging to veterans, to the world, to something larger than any one man. The collision course was set, and neither side appeared ready to blink. The denial of the jet was one thing. Harry's fiery response was another. But the true fracture line appeared when sponsors began to act. For months, corporations had tiptoed around his growing controversies, choosing to tolerate his volatility, so long as the Games remained untainted. But the steady drumbeat of scandal, Oprah interviews, Netflix drama, memoir outbursts, and now a petty war over travel perks, had shifted the equation. What once seemed like a glamorous royal connection now looked like a liability. The first sponsor to withdraw did so quietly, issuing a bland statement about strategic refocusing of charitable partnerships. But insiders knew the truth. Their board no longer wanted to explain why their millions might be subsidizing private jets for a prince living in California. One sponsor leaving could have been ignored, brushed off as coincidence. But when the second and the third followed within weeks, the pattern was undeniable. The corporate exodus had begun. Each departure fueled the press firestorm. Headlines shouted, "Invictus in peril." Sponsors flee amid Harry fury. Talk shows debated whether the Games could survive without their founder's royal sparkle. And worst of all, columnists began asking a question Harry had never prepared for. Was Invictus now bigger without him? For veterans, the answer was obvious. Many began stepping forward to insist publicly that the Games were not about princes or palaces, but about resilience, recovery, and the dignity of those who had served. Their voices carried weight. Their defiance carved deep wounds into Harry's pride. To see the very men and women he claimed to champion now openly suggest that Invictus would be better off without his drama was a humiliation unlike any other. Inside Montecito, Meghan worked overtime to spin the narrative. She contacted sympathetic journalists, orchestrating features that cast Harry as a visionary misunderstood by bureaucrats. She stressed his emotional bond with veterans, his sacrifice in founding the Games, his personal investment in their stories. But for every flattering article she pushed, 3 harsher ones erupted unbidden. The narrative had slipped beyond their control. Harry's outbursts had made the story too simple, too irresistible. A fallen prince demanding luxury, while the wounded heroes he championed quietly showed her hardship. At a high-profile veterans gala in London, an Invictus athlete, a decorated soldier who had lost both legs in Afghanistan, delivered a speech that electrified the audience. Without mentioning Harry by name, he declared, "The Games are not about privilege. They're not about palaces or perks. They are about us, our struggle, our triumph. And no one, no matter how famous, can take that from us." The room erupted in applause, thunderous and unrestrained. Clips of the speech went viral within hours, racking up millions of views. The contrast was brutal. Harry raging about jets in private, while veterans declared their independence in public. Reports from those close to him describe a man unraveling. He accused organizers of orchestrating a smear campaign. He ranted about disloyalty and betrayal. He insisted that Meghan leak selective details to remind the world of his sacrifices in uniform. But the more he fought, the weaker he looked. Each angry rebuttal only reinforced the perception of fragility, entitlement, and hypocrisy. What made the humiliation unbearable was not just the press or the sponsors. It was the silence from the palace. Where once Harry might have expected a cautious word of support, or at least a quiet intervention to steady the ship, now there was nothing. King Charles, Prince William, even Princess Anne, all remained tight-lipped, as though watching from afar, unwilling to lift a finger. Their silence was deafening. It signaled to the world that Harry stood alone, stripped of royal backing, his quarrel with Invictus entirely his own making. The media seized on the vacuum. Editorials suggested that Harry's royal family had abandoned him to his fate, that even they saw his feud as embarrassing. Paparazzi captured Harry and Meghan leaving a restaurant in Montecito, their faces drawn and strained. Tabloids splashed the photos with captions like, "A prince cornered and from founder to outcast." But Harry refused to step back. Instead, he plotted escalation. In private calls with confidants, he floated the idea of launching a rival event, an alternative veterans competition that he would control entirely, free from the meddling of Invictus leadership. The plan was thin, hastily imagined, but it reflected his desperation. If he couldn't dominate Invictus, he would replace it. Meghan, ever the strategist, encouraged the thought, seeing in it a way to reassert control and secure new funding. Yet even she admitted privately that the optics would be catastrophic. Splintering the very games he had built would make him appear not as a champion of veterans, but as a saboteur of their unity. Still, Harry pressed forward. His anger left him blind to the risks. He summoned advisors, drafted proposals, and floated the idea to potential backers. But whispers of his plan leaked almost immediately, and when they did, the backlash was swift and merciless. Veterans denounced the move as selfish. Journalists called it the ultimate betrayal. Sponsors recoiled at the thought of funding a vanity project born out of spite. The idea collapsed before it even began, leaving Harry more humiliated than before. For behind closed doors, Invictus leadership was preparing its boldest move yet. A rebranding campaign that would shift the spotlight entirely onto veterans, deliberately minimizing Harry's presence. The Games would be marketed not as the prince's vision, but as a global movement belonging to the people it served. Harry's name, once the centerpiece of every press release, would fade into the background. His face, once the draw for every fundraiser, would no longer be essential. What had once been his crowning achievement, the one thing that set him apart from his royal past, the one project universally respected, was slipping away before his eyes. And worst of all, he could do nothing to stop it. The rebrand was unveiled with quiet precision. A new campaign video dropped across social media platforms, featuring veterans from across the globe telling their stories, their voices raw, their faces unflinching. Clips of recovery, resilience, and triumph filled the screen. For years, these campaigns had ended with Harry's voice, his image, his personal stamp of royal gravitas. But this time, he was nowhere to be seen. No words from him. No footage of him. No acknowledgement that he had even been part of its founding. Harry's phone buzzed incessantly that day, not with support but with notifications. Journalists demanding comment. Friends sending sympathetic texts. Meghan urging him to stay calm, to ignore the optics. But how could he ignore them? For Harry, this wasn't just a campaign. It was a message carved in stone. The movement he birthed no longer belonged to him. At the opening ceremony of the Games, broadcast live across continents, the crowd erupted in applause as veterans marched proudly into the stadium. Flags waved, music thundered, emotion soared. Then the moment came, the official welcome address. For years, this had been Harry's domain. He had been the face at the podium, the voice that rallied athletes and audiences alike. But this time, it was different. The chair of the Invictus Foundation, a decorated general with decades of service, strode to the microphone instead. His speech was stirring, unapologetic, and utterly devoid of royal references. He spoke of sacrifice, of unity, of healing through competition. And then, with deliberate force, he declared, "The Invictus Games are built by veterans for veterans. They are not the property of any one person. They are the legacy of all who serve." The crowd roared. Cameras cut to athletes wiping tears from their faces, to audiences on their feet, clapping, cheering, chanting. The message was unmistakable. Invictus had broken free. Harry watched from afar, streaming the ceremony privately. Those close to him say his expression was unreadable, a tight mask hiding a storm within. Meghan sat beside him, whispering reassurances, insisting that the game's success was still a success. But Harry knew better. Success without him was not success for him. It was his ultimate defeat.